In this video, I will show you how to work wrap and turn short rows in garter stitch. It's very similar to working them in stockinette stitch, but with just a few differences. In this demo, let's say the pattern says to start your first short row on a right side row by knitting to 2 stitches before the end and then working a wrap and turn. I've gone ahead and already knitted a bunch of stitches, but let's go ahead and knit to 2 stitches before the end. Okay, so keeping the yarn in the back, insert the right needle into the next stitch on the left needle as if to purl, then slide it off of the left needle, then bring your yarn to the front of the work, then insert your left needle into that slip stitch and slip it back to the left needle. And then turn your work. So you've just worked your first short row. So now we're going to knit 2 stitches before the end of the next row. This is your wrong side row. It's a little hard to tell because we're in garter stitch and the right and the wrong look the same. Okay, just like with the first short row, when you get to 2 stitches before the end, you're going to insert the right needle into the next stitch on the left needle as if to purl, so through the front, and slide it onto the right needle. Then take the yarn and bring it to the front of the work. Then insert the left needle into that slip stitch and slide it back to the left needle. And then you're going to turn your work. Okay, so we've worked our first 2 short rows. Now on row 3, your pattern will instruct you to work to a certain number of stitches. In my patterns, I typically would say to knit to a certain amount of stitches from the end. So on row 3, it would be something like 4 to 5 stitches from the end, because with each short row, you are working further and further in from the edge. A pattern may instead say to knit to a certain amount of stitches from the last wrap stitch. If this is the case, then you need to find that wrap stitch. So here are 2 ways to identify a wrap stitch. One is you want to look for the gap. So in this case, you can see that there is a fairly wide gap right here, which makes sense because our first short row, we worked 2 stitches before the wrap and then we had wrapped that stitch. So it makes sense that this is the wrap stitch because the gap is right to the left of it. The other way that you can tell is you look for the strand that runs right underneath the stitch. Now this can be a little bit trickier in garter stitch because we have all these ridges here, but if you look closely and if you open up the work a little bit, you could see the difference between the regular bump here that you see with garter and the wrap. The wrap appears just a little bit lower. So those 2 ways, first looking for the gap and that the wrap stitch is always to the right of the gap, and looking for the strand that runs underneath the stitch. And it runs a little bit lower than regular garter stitch bumps. So in my pattern, I have said to knit to 5 stitches before the end. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. One, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 1 more to knit. Then I'm going to insert the right needle into the next stitch on the left needle as if to purl, slide it to the right needle, bring the yarn to the front, then slide the stitch back to the left needle, and then turn the work. So then we'll do the same thing on this side. We're going to knit to 5 stitches before the end. Now, as you can see, we're already in the middle of the work here. So 5 stitches before the end is right here. So we're actually only going to knit 2 stitches. Insert the right needle to the next stitch on the left needle, as if to purl, and slide it. Bring the yarn to the front of the work. Insert the left needle into that slip stitch and slide it back to the left. And then turn the work. Once you've finished all your short rows, if you had been working in stockinette stitch, it would have told you to knit or purl your wraps as you reach them, as you work the last 2 rows. But in garter stitch, you often don't have to do this because the ridges of the garter stitch will hide the wraps. Sometimes, however, you may still be instructed to knit the wraps. I've done this in a couple of my patterns. And the reason is because if you're working in garter stitch but knitting in a looser gauge, the garter ridges might not hide the wraps as much as they typically would. So the default would be that normally you do not have to knit the wraps as you reach them in garter stitch, but if your pattern tells you otherwise, you should follow what the pattern instructs you. What I'm going to do to demonstrate both ways is on this side, I'm going to knit to the end, not knitting the wraps. And when I turn and I work on this side, I will knit the wraps, just so I can show you both ways. So let's go ahead and knit to the very end. And as I do that, I'm not going to do anything with the wraps. I'm just going to knit my stitches like normal. Okay. And as you can see, you really can't see the wraps at all. They hide themselves well in garter stitch. But I'm going to turn the work. And as we work our way here, the 2 short rows that we had worked, I'm going to go ahead and knit those wraps. And remember what I had said before, when you need to identify your wraps, the easiest way in garter stitch is to look for the gap. So I can easily tell here, there's a gap here and there's a gap here. So the wrap stitch is going to be the stitch that's to the right of these gaps. Okay, so it looks like I've made it to my first wrap stitch. So to knit a wrap, you're going to take your right needle and you're going to insert it first into the wrap from the bottom of the wrap to the top, and then insert the right needle into the stitch. And then you're going to knit them together. Okay, I have one more wrap to knit. Insert the right needle into the wrap from bottom to top, then into the stitch, and then knit them together. And then I'll just go ahead and knit that last stitch. Okay, so we have finished our short rows, and I showed you how it looked to not knit the wraps as well as to knit the wraps. So that is how you work wrap and turn short rows in garter stitch.